Risk is now completely up with the first line and trying to drive the strategy of any financial institution. The biggest part of their job happens to be making sure that a crisis doesn't really happen.
Right.
Once the crisis happens, these are the people who step in the crisis zone and handle the crisis. That's what risk management is doing at this point of time. Not all technology is good for you, but you have to figure out which part of technology is actually very, very good for you.
If risk has become so important, right, where do you think it should sit in the sort of overall strategic conversations in a bank?
So it has to sit along.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Trust Matters podcast. Risk in banking isn't what it used to be. If you think about it, it's no longer about saying yes or no to a credit profile. It's about making smart strategic decisions that influence how banks grow and how they use technology, data, and more importantly, build customer trust. So we have a very special guest with us today, someone who spent more than 2 decades in the banking ecosystem. He's worked with ICICI Bank, HSBC, Aditya Birla Capital, Centrum, and today he serves as the Chief Risk Officer at Unity Small Finance Bank. Saurabh Srivastava, thank you so much for joining us for this podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
We're very excited to have you here.
Thank you.
Risk in the banking ecosystem has been evolving over the last 2 years, and I think you've been through the whole journey of it. So given that, I would love to get your perspective on first, what is the role of risk in a bank, like the risk function?
So let me just try and begin with what the role is today, right? Today, risk happens to be a function which has now become very, very integrated with the entire strategy and the opportunity in the banking space. Mm-hmm. What you have in banks is basically 4 stakeholders. You have your customers who are looking for you to be stable, you to be trustworthy, and you to give good services. Then you have your board, which is looking for good governance. It's looking for a strong balance sheet, which will then probably translate into good brand or better brand. Then you have your employees. What are employees looking for? They're looking for transparency, and they're looking for at any point of time, consistency. Right. Last but not the least, and these are the most important ones, are your shareholders. They're looking for good income. They're looking for consistently rising income and profits, and they're looking for a good wealth creation. All of this happens if a bank is able to build trust for everybody, saying all of this will be delivered to all of them. Now, that basically means that the bank needs to have various goals which are going to be there for them to be able to achieve all of these kinds of things. What that actually means is that the bank at any given point of time has to continuously keep evaluating opportunities to achieve these goals. Right. And when they're evaluating these opportunities, they have to also evaluate what exactly is the pitfall that is available, or what is the pitfall that can actually happen or stop them from achieving this particular goal. Now, when I say pitfall, that basically means identifying what the risk factors are in basically being able to achieve the goal. The second step is to go ahead and measure what is the likely impact of this particular pitfall, or what is the likely impact of this risk factor on the goal that we're actually trying to achieve. Then you mitigate. You figure out what could be the likely impact, and accordingly you come up with a mitigating measure. Last but not the least, you just monitor it all the way around to make sure that you put in the right mitigant. And if you haven't, you could quickly modify and put in the right mitigant at any given point of time. So that's what risk has become. Now, from a time when risk used to be somebody who used to look at data and then, kind of come up with certain things and deliver certain things post-mortem, risk is now completely up with the first line and trying to drive the strategy of any financial institution. Now, the example that I always like to give happens to be, when you think of heroes in this society, who do you think of? You think of soldiers, you think of firefighters, you think of, let's say, surgeons. What are these people trying to do? What these people are trying to do is that the biggest part of their job happens to be making sure that a crisis doesn't really happen.
Right.
Once the crisis happens, these are the people who step in the crisis zone and handle the crisis. That's what risk management is doing at this point of time. That's how I would like to sum it all up.
Yeah,
for
no,
you.
I think that's a very interesting perspective. I think I've never heard that before, and that's a great way to put it, right? I mean, they are the front line, but then when things do happen, they're also those same folks that actually are trying to mitigate the problem that happened.
Absolutely.
And interestingly, I think what I heard from you, which again is something new, is the four stakeholders, right? So I've heard of obviously the shareholders and maybe the board as well, but I've never heard the employees as being sort of the key stakeholders in this whole risk scenario. So that's sort of an interesting take on it. So thank you for that. From a philosophy standpoint, right? If I were to say, what is the philosophy of risk that you espouse, right? And how you operate? And I think, how do you look at building out the risks function within the bank itself, right? So you've done this now several times. So would love to hear your perspective on that.
Sure. Just because you use the word philosophy, the philosophy of risk management that I imbibe happens to be in between quotes by two very, very, esteemed individuals that I hold in very high regard. The first one is Warren Buffett. He says risk happens when you don't know what you're doing, right? And then there is Rumi, who turns around and says that the art of knowing is knowing what to ignore. So risk management lies right in between these two. You have to know what you're doing, and you have to know what to ignore.
Yeah.
Right. So therefore, you figure out what your focus has to be on. What is the likely impact of this particular factor that you're focusing upon, and then to continuously keep sharpening yourself or sharpening the strategy around that so that the impact becomes lesser and lesser. That's the philosophy around the whole piece. Now, how do you... At this point of time, what has happened is that over the years, risk has completely changed.
Right.
Today, the conversations in the boardrooms are more around cybersecurity. They're more around what is going on as far as the whole fraud risk environment is actually concerned, along with the cybersecurity piece. And since today, the entire world seems to be sitting on a keg of gunpowder, the markets happens to be a very big risk that we have to look at.
Right.
Another thing which has now come right in forefront, and I believe that's something that your organization as well faces, happens to be models. Managing these models, because of the fact that the time to a particular customer has become very, very short. Right. That is what the market has actually become. Instead of you being able to take 3 days or 3 months, depending upon what the size of the credit was, to go back to a particular customer, it's a matter of minutes now.
Right.
A matter of minutes can only happen when you have certain models which are running. These models could be either the statistical regression models, they could be machine learning, they could be AI models. And governing all of these models has become a very big part of what is the conversation that happens in a boardroom as far as risk is concerned. Absolutely. So therefore, risk has had to change itself from traditionally managing just credit risk or possibly operational risk into now managing all of these factors which I just mentioned, which has just made the scope very, very broad.
Right.
At this point.
I think that's a very interesting point, because I think, again, traditionally, if you say risk and banking, people go very naturally towards the credit risk is essentially, or underwriting is what you're talking about. And I think with the advent of now, I wouldn't say advent, but I think the proliferation of AI and all of these things that are making it easier for fraudsters to also access, but also internally for banks to think about, like you said, the model, because that's not something typically people would look at and say, there is risk in that model if it's not governed right. And I think the key operating word is governance, right? Having the right governance in place. And that means your ambit actually has sort of grown significantly. And it's no longer just that one sort of piece in the corner. It goes to the credit team. They verify risk and they come back. That's interesting. So, then in that case, then how would you sort of, if you were to tell other risk folks or people getting into this function and thinking about it, how should they think about risk now? So how do they need to change their mindset and start focusing on what parts of risk, and how do you think of risk actually?
Okay. And I would actually try and limit myself to banking, because that's where my expertise actually lies. So anybody who's joining risk, my advice would be, just please try and learn as much about the varied sides of risk. Don't just limit yourself to, let's say, just credit risk, or don't just limit yourself to just cybersecurity risk, for example. There are various aspects of risk. There is a credit, very obviously. There is operational risk. There's fraud risk. There is cybersecurity risk. And then now there is a much bigger function which has come into place, which is called enterprise risk management, which are people who are just simply looking at the strength of our balance sheet, stress testing it, and trying to figure out what is the kind of stress that the balance sheet can actually take, and what are the steps that we need to put in place to make sure that if these stresses were to play out, we would have enough mitigants available for us to be able to do something about it. Right? Markets risk is a very, very important function at this point of time. So risk in itself has just become too broad-based right now. And for you to be able to succeed in risk, you have to have first an education in all of these areas, and then to be able to figure out how exactly to marry the whole thing at a central level for you to be able to deliver a consistent strategy of risk across. Now, all of these pieces, for example, fraud risk today uses a huge amount of technology. Now, that technology comes both in the IT space as well as in the cybersecurity space. So cybersecurity and fraud risk are joined at the hip. So somebody has to be able to understand that and then deliver a consistent strategy across. And that's what you have to learn to be able to grow in the risk world today.
Yeah, interesting. But so I think it's I feel like what you described maybe is one is your role, which is a much broader sort of understanding of all the risk. Sorry, if I would call it vectors around the bank. But then for someone getting into it is also to either obviously have depth in one of them, but then also understand that risk is not what you traditionally consider risk, but it's sort of moved on past that. So, if risk has become so important, right, where do you think it should sit in the sort of overall strategic conversations in a bank?
So it has to sit along with everything that the bank is planning to do. It's at the planning stage that risk comes right in there. We were just talking about the fact that, the time to the customer has become very, very short. So therefore, any product which has to be launched into the market has to first have the decision model right. So the decision model has to be made sure that it is working out. It is delivering the kind of credit costs that you want to incur, which is a part of what the board has approved for you. And then is when you go into the market. And risk then continuously keeps looking at that model to see whether it's being able to deliver the right kind of credit costs or not. And, things become so much more interesting with AI coming into the picture. And from the fact that you were looking at what is the kind of variables that are going into the model and what is the output that is coming out into the space, you've suddenly changed into figuring out if the AI model is hallucinating or not. And it's a very, very interesting word for me because it just becomes blue sky then. You're just suddenly looking at what is the kind of combinations is this, mind being able to figure out on its own and putting into place. So there are a lot of things which are developing at this point of time at a speed where one has to be continuously able to educate himself to be able to get to the next piece. Now, this is something that I actually learned from an insurance colleague of mine who turns around and says that, you just have to prepare yourself, or you have to be constantly on your toes, because the next curveball that's going to come towards you is going to be completely different from what's there in your playbook. So people are going to innovate, people are going to hit you with very different risks, and you just have to be constantly on your toes to be able to manage that.
Yeah, and that's it's interesting because that's hard to do. I mean, that's like you're sort of constantly looking for problems and saying, okay, how do I mitigate this problem, right? So I think one last point around this is, in terms of, I think what is now one belief that the Indian banking ecosystem has, which you think is outdated and needs to be sort of brought to the current day and age?
That's a difficult question to answer, because having been in the banking industry for so long now, I would like to think that our banking industry, though it has been hit with so many frauds and everything, happens to be an industry which so far stands very well on its own morality, which is basically something that continuously keeps pointing it towards the direction of north, and they continuously keep performing. But yes, being able to adapt to the newer and newer technology that is actually there in the market is something that the entire banking space has to take up. What is happening is that we are creating silos within banks, which is turning around and saying just this unit will use the digital part of things to decision pieces and do their business, while the rest of it can actually just continue working in that old format and manner, which is something that needs to be changed. And there are pioneers who've shown us that. I mean, various companies which are NBFCs as well as banks, which have basically shown us the fact that if you adapt technology, and not just here in India, even abroad, you adapt technology, you're going to be rewarded. You're not only going to be rewarded with a good asset book, you're also going to be rewarded in the market by the shareholders.
Shareholders, right. No, absolutely. Now, let me switch a little bit to more talking about sort of frameworks and guardrails that need to be in place, right? So from a principle standpoint, so your principles on how you design the risk function, right? What are some of the key things that you have brought in where you say, like, these are some principles I've brought in which I think stand the test of time and sort of build the strength of the bank in your function?
Sure. So first and foremost is about the adoption of technology. Not all technology is good for you, but you have to figure out which part of technology is actually very, very good for you. There are times when you get faced with models which are talking about very, very bizarre kind of data and being able to form a decision out of that bizarre data. And there are times when you just have to look at it and say, no, this doesn't really work. Now, that's a very, very difficult decision to take because of the fact that all these models are always very well researched and they're backed by data and things like that. However, the ability to be able to turn around and say that this works for the organization and this does not work for the organization and build that as a culture is probably the one thing that I would like, or I would like to think that I've contributed to the bank that I am with at this point in time. The other piece is this whole thing about digital adoption. Adopting digital frameworks, adopting digital models to be able to govern them and to be able to turn around and say, no, I completely believe I will not run a parallel process in the back office and continuously keep validating what they're actually doing, is something that I think I've contributed to this particular bank. We've now adopted, and I must confess that at this point of time, we are a largely digital bank, but we still have traditional areas. So therefore, we still have this whole thing about digital piece working in silos, but we're trying to become as digital as possible.
No, I think, and I think most banks have gone through that journey where, from being barely digital to now getting to a point where they're trying to be digital. And I think it's a work in progress. I think it's not easy to do when you have customers, you have, new initiatives and products, and yet you have to make the change. So I think the one question that I always, I think I hear sometimes is, yeah, great. And I don't think anyone discounts it, but risk adds friction, right? And how do you sort of balance having good risk governance in place with sort of the growth initiatives and the expectations of, let's say, the shareholders that it has to continue to grow at a certain pace?
Absolutely. So the one thing that I believe in, and this is something that I've followed in my career, and I do try and make sure that the people who join risk follow the same ethos, is somebody who comes into risk should first have experienced business. How difficult it is to actually walk up to a particular client and to convince him or her to be able to either place their money with us or to be taking our money at whatever other interest rates that we're actually giving. So once you've experienced that world, you understand how difficult or how good that job or how bad or ugly that job actually is. And that holds you in a good stead when you actually become a risk manager. That's when you start having conversations which are more practical rather than just theoretical, saying there's something written in a particular piece of paper, so therefore I have to make sure that that's implemented. That's not what the job of risk is. As I said, you have to identify the right risk. You have to know what to ignore and what to focus on, and then to be able to deliver a mitigant. That's what the whole idea about risk is. So first work in the sales side, first work with clients, figure out what clients want and how difficult it is to be able to get a client for the bank, and then come over onto risk, and you'll be a much better risk manager. That's an advice that I continuously keep giving to just about everybody who joins in my outfit, at least.
Right. Yeah, no, I think very interesting perspective, because typically I think people look at the risk function and folks in the risk as being the really, sort of, they are cut and dry. Yeah. I mean, for them, it's this or that. There is no gray area as such. And typically, probably there isn't enough, there's not a lot of gray area, but I think it's this perspective that you're talking about, which is, I have worked with the customer, I know what the reality is, and then I sort of play the risk game. Yeah. Right? So I think that's a very interesting perspective. Hopefully people take that as a way to, figure out how to get into risk. So now, all of this actually comes down to, I think we also very strongly believe, comes down to one word: trust, right? So at a fundamental level, how do you think banks are building sort of trust? What is it that they're doing? Is it just the risk function? Is it something else? What is it?
I'll come back to my first answer when I said that there are four sorts of broad stakeholders as far as the bank is concerned. And these are people who look at trust in a very, very different manner. Your customers are looking at a stable organization that they can put their money with or borrow money from. And tomorrow, when they actually need money, they can go back to that client or they can go back to that bank and actually be able to borrow more. Right. So they're looking for stability. That, to their mind, and good service is trust. Okay. When you look at the board is looking at good governance. That, to their mind, is all about trust. When you look at the shareholders, they're looking at a very, very strong balance sheet, and to their mind, that is what translates into trust. When you look at employees, they're looking at consistency and transparency, and that's what, to their minds, translates into trust. If you are able to deliver consistent practices and transparent practices to your employees, that's the best thing that you can actually do. So trust, to my mind, means different things to different people, and it has to be delivered in that format and manner to these people to be able to trust an organization. Organizations which are, multinational banks which have been there since hundreds of years, that, to my mind, is the only thing that they've been able to deliver, which is actually contributed to their brand name, which has made them stay in the business for such a long time.
Right. No, fair. And I think, again, I think the word trust is also very loosely used in sort of the ecosystem, right? And I think the way you sort of framed it, which is trust has different flavors. Yes, fundamentally it's still trust, right? But it has different flavors, and how people sort of get trust and prescribe trust to who they work with is different based on their needs. And so it's a tough job, I think, to have four different stakeholders with four different meanings of trust, but yet you have to deliver for all four.
And that too when the environment is changing so much.
Yes, and it's constantly changing, right? So I don't know if I can trust, and then, but like maybe I can. And I think, one question I'd just ask is, with AI coming in at the scale and the pace it's coming in, does it really start to affect this conversation around trust?
No, not exactly. Because so one of the good things that we have in this country is that we have a very, very involved regulator. So they've basically also picked up this whole piece about AI, and they've set up guidelines, and you are the only thing that you need to do about AI in a practical way. The regulator said something, you're supposed to do something, Basel's coming up with certain guidelines and things like that. But what is it at the crux of the matter, the core of the matter happens to be the fact that as long as you can control AI, it is a very, very good thing to have. It's a companion to have. It just basically means that your job changes. Instead of verifying what is actually happening and instead of continuously taking the decision yourself, you are looking at a sort of younger brother to say and figure out if he or she or that AI is taking the right decisions. Are they making the right combinations? Are they making the right logic? Are they putting the logic in the right place and taking the right decision? So the job in itself becomes that of supervision rather than taking the decision yourself. As long as one understands that, AI can't really be treated as an adversary. It has to be treated as somebody that you can rely upon to be able to get the job done. It's just that you have to change yourself to be able to adapt to AI.
Right.
That's the approach that you have to actually use.
Right. Because I think, with AI, I think there's been a lot of fear mongering as well. And maybe some cases rightly so, because it's made it easier for fraudsters to deepfake AI sort of videos and images and also maybe documents. And so there's a whole slew of sort of AI related fraud that's coming in. And I'm starting to hear some buzz, at least from a consumer standpoint, that AI is now, kind of, how do I trust what I see? Like, it's almost, I can't trust my eyes anymore. And so I think for a bank, it becomes that much harder because traditionally frauds, if you look at it, it is where money is, right? And so banks are the first ones that are hit. And so that I think that becomes that much tougher for someone like you in your position to keep projecting that, we know what's happening, and sort of we have our own AI to probably combat and sort of mitigate what risks show up. And so I don't envy your position.
Yeah, no. See, the other thing is that we don't have to do everything ourselves.
Right.
Okay. We can use a lot of partners like yourselves as IDfy, which can help us with a lot of things. Maybe they can help us in certain areas, and we may need to find other partners who can help us with other areas. But we don't have to do everything because of the fact that there is a lot of research and there is a lot of good work that is being put in by partners. And at the same time, the bank can just simply adopt that research and make sure that it becomes much more secure at any given point of time. Now, just to touch upon the point that you were talking about, the fact that AI is coming in is not something which is new. At a point in time, there were computers that were coming into the banking industry, and everybody was saying, things are changing so much, and what is going on and what's going to happen. And then suddenly it was the Y2K moment that was coming in, and nobody knew, will the entire banking system collapse and what is going to happen and things like that. So like this, there have been many things which have actually come in, and people have been able to adapt to it. Right. It's just about being able to have the right attitude. Now, every time, there is a particular colleague of mine who just comes to me and talks to me about the fact that, we need to look at it in a different manner and we need to look at it in a different way of sort and everything. And my only comment to him happens to be the fact that, yes, we need to look at it in a different manner, but we still need to wear our banker's hat. There is something which is called a gut instinct, which actually develops after so much of experience, and you're able to deliver certain things because of that. Or there are certain things which when you look at them, the logic does not make the right sense. As long as you have that, let it be AI, let it be any other technology that comes in, let it be any other adoption that happens in banking, we will be able to, assimilate that and just become better. Right. That's the attitude I think we always continuously need to have.
Yeah, and I think to me, one of the big thing that's happened is the time has shrunk now. That's the only difference I would say. Like you said, earlier it would be a 5-year horizon, 10-year horizon. Now it's 3 months, 6 months. That's all it is, and you have to continuously adapt. So I think, from a risk professional, I think the one thing that sounds like you must have is this ability to continuously evolve. Just know what's happening, evolve, like you said, adapt it to your needs, and then continue sort of building. Such as the last bit that I want to talk about is kind of what does 2030 look like for the risk landscape, right? So do you see the role of the risk leader change as we evolve in the next 3 to 5 years?
Yes, because of the fact that what I see is risk has to be, as I talked about, the fact right at the forefront. Every time you go about launching anything, there has to be a discussion in and around what exactly is the risk in this and how exactly do we go about mitigating this. Now, which actually means that every time anything is done, were you to launch a particular product, were you to launch a particular service, like for example, if you were to launch mobile banking or an internet banking, which has now become so basic in banking, all of these require a risk assessment before they're actually handed over to a particular customer. That's basically because risk has evolved. It's cybersecurity is such a big risk. So every time you want to hand over a particular product to your customer, like internet banking or mobile banking, you better have assessed the cybersecurity risk and only then handed it over to your customer to use. Because at the end of the day, you are somebody that the customer is trusting with his or her money. And you have to be able to make sure that it is secure. That's the important part of it. Now, to your question, in what exactly may happen in 2030, I think AI will play a huge role as far as banking is concerned, because of the fact that there are a lot of basic tasks in banking which can actually get taken over by AI. But what does that mean? That basically means that we will all have to adapt ourselves and become people who are then looking at AI from a supervision point of view. Rather than taking the decision ourselves, we are continuously looking at what's happening and what kind of decisions are getting taken and are they the right decisions. So it doesn't make you redundant. It just makes you want to adapt, or it just warrants that you adapt and adopt the technology that is actually coming in. And I do believe that the next piece or the entire next era is going to be AI driven.
Right. Yeah. And I think it just seems to me that with AI, I mean, of course, there's going to be a lot more complexity in trying to understand, because I think I see AI models now spitting out. And I think the one point that you really brought out, which struck to me, was, see, the customer now has options, right? 2 minutes, you don't respond to me. Guess what? I don't have the patience, right? Now, AI can help you do that fast, but there is a problem with that as well. Is that AI been trained the right way? Is it, following the right guardrails and frameworks to make sure that within 2 minutes you're getting the right answer and not just an answer? Because over time that could compound to a risk that the bank is not able to carry. Because that just takes time for it. But at the pace which we're going, 1 year later, suddenly it blows up. So I think that's a very interesting point, that like risk is going to, one, not go away. And it's going to continuously evolve. And I think the folks that are in the risk space are going to be that much more critical to the success of an organization.
Absolutely. So there's a line that kind of resonates, and I'm sorry, I'm just going to be shifting back to poetry.
No, please.
So another one of the poets that I kind of idolize quite a bit is Faiz Ahmed Faiz. And with his leave and the fact that I would like to take leave from the purists, these were lines which were written for a very different purpose in a very different time, but they kind of resonate with me. And it says, and I'm just going to use one line out of that entire set of ghazal that he's actually written, and it goes, मुझसे पहली सी मोहब्बत मेरे महबूब न मांग.
Yes.
So it has to change. Change is the constant, and you have to change and adapt to be able to be successful in any area, and more so in risk right now.
Fantastic. I think one last bit I'd ask you is, in 30 seconds, maybe, if one piece of advice that you could give for the risk leaders of tomorrow, what would that be?
Adopt technology. That's the factor which is going to change everything. But see it as a complement to what you're doing. It'll help you take better decisions, and it will also add to that entire complexity that risk has become. It will just add to simplification. It will lead to simplification. The more you adapt to technology, it will take you to a place where you're going to be able to understand the whole gamut, and you're going to be able to understand it under one umbrella. And the only way that this happens is through technology. So please adopt technology. that is going nowhere. It is only going to become better and better, and it's just going to become more and more vast. So if you start adopting to it right now, maybe you won't have such an uphill task later. So better sooner than later.
Better sooner than later. Absolutely. Well, Saurabh, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. This was definitely an eye-opening conversation, and I think there are a few things that you said which are going to stick with me, and hopefully folks that are listening, that risk is one, it's an exciting space. I think what I think changed for me, and if I were to think about, it's not one of those sort of back office, nobody knows what's going on, it's just they just put friction for us. It's not that anymore. It's a very vibrant, sort of active part of the business with a very with a huge strategic value to the organization, and I think people need to just look at it from that lens and understand maybe that not only as a function, but maybe even as a career, it's a pretty exciting space to be.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and thank you for talking to us about risk today.
It's been my pleasure.
Thank you.